Soki na kati koteka pasi Greetings to all of you have joined us from across the globe, particularly from Europe, the Caribbean, and North America, South America, Latin America, and of course at home on the continent in Africa, Southern Africa in particular, but also Zimbabwe in particular. Welcome. We didn't expect to begin the Surplus Trust Policy Dialogue Forum on this note, but so dramatic have been the developments around Venezuela that we felt it compulsory almost that we should address this and respond to it as we should, as people who are concerned about the global affairs and the participants in the global affairs. And we're very fortunate and grateful that we had very prompt responses from those we approached to join us in this conversation. And I want to thank in particular Professor Stephen Chan, a regular on our programs from time to time. And I want to add that apart from his very distinguished career as an academic, as professor at SOAS, and has been very busy, is also my contemporary. We met during the Zimbabwe independence period, and he spent some time in Zimbabwe. So we are not only contemporaries, but we are brothers. So welcome, Stephen. And then we have another brother of mine from the Caribbean, not too far in terms of the issues that concern us. Felipe Nogueira, an activist of, 50, 60 years, from Dar es Salaam days, Swahili Sana, and now we are working together in the global Pan-African movement. He is representing the Caribbean and North America generally, but a very active member of my committee, the Global Pan-African Movement Governing Council. Philip, karibu sana, bwana.
Asante sana, karibuni. Greetings, everyone. Welcome. It's a pleasure.
We have a young academic, two young academics. One is Philip Paul Nantulia, who's everything. He's East African, he's Southern African, he's Tanzanian, he's Kenyan, he's Zimbabwean. Swahili sana. Habari gani mzee? Shikamoo.
Marhaba.
And last but not least, my young lady, young sister from Zimbabwe, Tafazo Choto, budding academic, an activist, labor activist. She runs the center, the Zimbabwe Labor Center. She's now at UJ doing a PhD. Tafazo, welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. So, as I said earlier on, it's a momentous times. These are things that used to happen in our times, Philip and Stephen. In the heyday of the anti-imperial struggle. Did you ever imagine something like this would happen in 2026? On the 3rd of January 2026? Invasion of Venezuela and the abduction of the head of state and his wife, just incredible. And maybe Philippe will explain to us later about that. But for the time being, it's really to ask Professor Chan to explain to us what's going on. Professor.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you, and hello to all of my colleagues and to everybody who's watching the show. Look, what happened took everyone around the world by surprise. It took the Europeans by surprise. It took the Chinese by surprise. There's no part of the world that was not stunned by the audacity of what Trump did in Venezuela. And I think that a huge number of Republicans in the United States were also surprised. I was in Washington 1 week before the elections, and no one was expecting that if Trump won, that his second term would be as audacious as it was. And of course, The first year was particularly audacious in terms of the tariffs that he launched upon the world at large. No one was expecting those. The scope, the scale of them, and the areas that the tariffs were directed against, even very, very vulnerable areas, very vulnerable countries. And it seemed to be something that was almost ideological in his mind. He was convinced this is what he should do. He set about doing it, and damn the consequences. And just as we were coming to the end of 2025 and thought, okay, 2026 has got to be better, and it turns out, of course, in the very first few days of 2026, it wasn't better. And as I said, no one in Europe was expecting that there would be this operation in Venezuela. The consensus in defense and foreign policy circles in most European governments was that an invasion would be too costly for the United States. No one was expecting, however, an extraction, a targeted extraction of the sort that happened, centered on the president and those closest to him, such as his wife. The audacity of that, not to mention the skill with which it was pulled off, although a lot more people were killed than were first admitted, but the audacity of kidnapping essentially a head of state, a head of government, taking him to the United States and putting him on trial, that stunned everybody. No one, as I said, expected that. It certainly stunned the Venezuelans themselves. They weren't expecting that either. But it raises all kinds of questions of international law, of course. Can you do this without just cause and international law? The indictment that the Americans prepared and presented in a US court of law against Maduro, in legal terms, in terms of my reading of it, is essentially fallacious. What seems to be going on is a desire not to find him guilty in a court of law in America, but to keep him in America for as long as possible under these false charges and charges that keep being appealed and appealed for year after year. Basically, the aim seems to be to take him out of circulation. Whether to take him out of circulation or whether it's actual full-blown regime change, that remains to be seen, just how far they can go with regime change, just how far they can go with acquiring the bulk of the oil that Venezuela produces. All of these things will be played out in the next few weeks. But it does change the whole complexion of how people view foreign policy around the world. Suddenly, power politics is back in the frame, something that most governments thought had taken a little bit of a back seat as a more cooperative institutional, organizational era had taken over. Faith in institutions like the United Nations, faith in institutions, even those that have not been particularly effective, like the International Criminal Court, and the International Criminal Court and Court of Justice. All of these things people are hoping would herald, as it were, a more cooperative, institutionalized way forward. Trump has ruined all of that. A one-man ban with a unilateral foreign policy, targeting world leaders, kidnapping them, that basically changes the whole complexion of what is going to be happening in the rest of the world. And of course, there's now a long list of countries who are frightened they might be next, including in the Caribbean, of course, and including in Africa, including in Europe. Now, this is the stunning thing. What you have in the case of Denmark and Greenland is a case of a European power, Denmark. It's a member of NATO. It's basically a member in good standing of the entire apparatus of the Western Alliance. Greenland has been part of Denmark for hundreds of years, and for 3,000 years, it has been culturally a part of Denmark. It's a very, very large part of Denmark. It's probably the largest part of Denmark, and is divided into three areas: metropolitan Denmark, the Faroe Islands, and then Greenland. But it's also the most sparsely populated. In this huge area, there's only 60,000 people who are living there. And most of those are congregated around the coast. It's a country that is largely frozen for most of the year. The whole centerpiece of the country is under ice for much of the year. You've got some oil and some mineral reserves on the coastal areas, not yet fully explored, but the Americans in particular have not made any effort to ask for exploration licenses of any great, as it were, nature in those areas. So what the country subsists on is fisheries. That's the main source of its income. In short, it may be a rich country in the making, but it's not a rich country now. It depends absolutely on metropolitan Denmark for its income, because with the country under ice, you have to import food. You can't grow your own food, for instance. Fisheries are it at this moment in time. But what it occupies is, in Trump's mind, this is very much World War II thinking, this is very much Cold War thinking. It occupies a strategic location in terms of where it is between the West and Russia. Not just in terms of providing some kind of land bridge, but in terms of providing, as it were, overflight zones. So if it comes to war, which is fought in an aerial fashion, using ballistic missiles, using drones, maybe even using what are now old-fashioned aircraft, what you've got is this landmass with airspace. That is its real strategic value. It's a World War II value. Here is something which is strategically located, but also its modern strategic value in technological terms, in terms of new forms of warfare that depend on command of the air. So Trump basically has this idea that if he can command this space, then he can command all kinds of future militarized activities if it comes to that kind of firefight, particularly with Russia. So he's looking to a future which is not peaceful. He's looking to a future in which America asserts its power through militarized muscle. And it's this that also alarms the Americans. If Trump decides to make a movement for Greenland, if he invades it, because there's no president or prime minister of any merit to extract, like he extracted Maduro from Venezuela. You've got an elected prime minister of Greenland, has a constitutional place in the government also of Denmark. It's an autonomous region of Denmark, but he's not been involved in any controversy. He's not been involved in any struggles for control of oil. He basically controls a small population, none of whom are delirious with joy at being forced to join the United States. A recent poll suggested that 80% of Greenlanders did not want to be part of the United States. There's been a small independence movement to be independent from Denmark as well, but everyone in Greenland understands that economically the country can have no traction by itself. It would be economically dependent on Denmark. And so they're basically liking and lumping it at the same time. And no one actually wants to change from the status quo right now. In other words, a takeover of Greenland would be against the wishes of the people. It would be an incursion, perhaps a full-scale invasion of a member of NATO. And all members of NATO are obliged under treaty to defend one another. And that's what's being discussed right now in European capitals. If push comes to shove, if there's military action, if the Greenlanders and the Danish call upon us for assistance militarily, because the armies are very, very small. There's no army at all in Greenland. The army of Denmark is very, very small, has very little technological capacity. They would be obliged to call on NATO members for assistance. NATO members would be obliged to lend assistance, and that means military assistance. This means war within the Western Alliance. This means the end of the Western Alliance as we've known it since the end of World War II. This means absolutely uncertain horizons in terms of world peace, because the knock-on effects of a violent Europe on the rest of the world would be a total destabilization of international relations. Everyone, for instance, depends on a peaceful Europe with whom they can trade. The amount of trade that the world conducts with Europe is phenomenal. Whether you like it or not, everyone is dependent on European economies. Everyone sees Europe as a destination of prosperity. That's why there's so much, as it were, migration, often illegal migration to Europe. Everyone wants to send home remittances to Africa, to other parts of the world, from having jobs in Europe. It's absolutely strategic in everybody's point of view. The Chinese are so heavily invested in Europe. If you took Europe out of their economic equation, was no longer underneath Chinese economic leverage to the extent that it is, then that would have a huge effect on the Chinese economy as well. So NATO going to war over Greenland, which is a distant but a real possibility, would be the end of all kinds of things, not just NATO, but Europe's place in the world and the world's reliance on Europe. So Africa would not be unaffected, the Caribbean would not be unaffected. As I said, like it or lump it, we're all tied in together in a web of interdependence right now, and everyone is to a certain extent dependent on Europe being stable as well as prosperous. So Trump risks everything by his rhetoric. Now, he basically references the Louisiana Purchase, whereby the Americans purchased Louisiana from the French. Those were very, very old days, long gone. Basically, no one is wanting to sell Greenland to the United States either, least of all the Greenlanders. They might let the Americans build more bases there. There's already American military presence there. The Danish have gone out of their way to facilitate, as it were, some kind of provision for American fears of the geostrategic situation in that part of the world. But to basically give up Greenland as an entity, that would be unheard of in terms of the formulations of every single foreign ministry and every single defense ministry in Europe right now. So the European leaders are going to go into conclave and work out some kind of common approach. They did not have a common approach over Venezuela. They were divided. People like the British Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, basically pussyfooted around the issue of whether Maduro was a legitimate president. Well, who is a legitimate president? Who decides is the key question. What is the transparency in the decision? By one man in America being able to say who is legitimate or who is not, or one man in the United Kingdom asking the same question. You could ask the same question of half the world's presidents. Who's legitimate? Is even Trump legitimate in the way he's been defying the Constitution of the United States of America? So the whole question of legitimacy as an excuse for extracting Maduro doesn't hold water. What you do have is the issue of sovereignty, sovereign right. Does a country anymore have the right to conduct its own affairs in an independent way? Will its independent sovereignty be respected? The whole world order right now is founded on the respect for independent sovereignty. That's why we haven't gone to war with Russia, although Russia has certainly gone to war with Ukraine. It's why reluctantly the Chinese have not invaded Taiwan, although they have plans to be able to do that. It's a fragile stability the world has right now, but that fragile stability is built on respect for national sovereignty. Take that away as the underpinning foundation of world order, and you've got an era of chaos looming ahead. It'll be militarized chaos. Above all, it'll be economic meltdown chaos. So what's being discussed in Europe right now is not just small fry. The fry is so big that European leaders are having a huge amount of difficulty working out where to start. Probably what will happen is that the French, Macron, will take the lead in terms of the formulations, but he himself is under domestic threat. He's not certain to have a very good time at the next French elections, for instance. Without his intellectual leadership and his organization of the thoughts of the European leaders, you can expect that there will not be, as it were, the kind of coherent formulation that Europe will need to be able to face down this growing threat from Trump. Trump, is he going to be advised by his own people that he might be biting off more than he can chew in terms of the cost of what this will be to the United States? The terrible thing is that when you look at American international relations, Trump is being advised by expert academicians who buy into the theory of power, the exercise of power, and they see Trump as the champion of this theoretical approach made real. So you're not going to expect, as it were, an intellectual riposte from the American Academy, which is being defenestrated right now by Trump and his attacks on places like Harvard and Columbia. You're looking at an emasculated America, even an emasculated Republican Party. It's Trump and those around him in the White House, making it up as they go along, thinking they're the sheriff in town, everyone else is a baddie. You've got the Europeans now frantically trying to get some kind of coherent response together. But I would make one prediction. If push comes to shove, Europe will not let Greenland go. So all hell to pay perhaps for the future. That would be my words of introduction, Mr. Chairman.
It's a very good start, Stephen. Just have two questions. One, is Trump an aberration in relation to what would normally be expected of the American foreign policy in this era?
He's got his loyalists in key positions in the State Department, for instance. He has people who are theoretically aligned to him in key governmental and non-governmental institutions in the United States of America. He's put his influence into the US Institute of Peace and into other think tanks. Basically, he's got some supporting wind in America. Those who want to be part of this government, no matter how brilliant intellectually they may be, are singing his tune. Basically, when I was in Washington, I've kept touch with these people we might say are moderate Republicans, if there is such a thing. No one is going to say boo to Donald Trump. In other words, he's got a license to proceed in the way that he has been proceeding. And you can take, as it were, as a cue, the response in America to the tariffs that he imposed in his first year. Many countries, including many African countries, suffered bitterly because of the tariffs. No one said boo. Look at the swinging cuts in aid, particularly in terms of health aid to Africa. No one in Washington said boo to that inhumane act of suddenly cutting off humane aid, vaccines and things of that nature to suffering people in a continent like Africa. So no one is basically raising an objection to the extraction of Maduro. Whether they would raise an objection to a militarized incursion into Greenland, well, that's another question. Now, I've looked at the military maps. Because Greenland is populated largely on the coastal areas, there's no deep population in the frozen center of the country. A military action could be very swift to take over the key and strategic locations of Greenland. A single major American militarized airlift, parachutists, could do it. The Americans know that. And so basically the question is, will Denmark call for help if that happens? Well, the answer is simple. They have to call for help because they've got no standing militarized response of their own. They'll be overwhelmed in a matter of one day, my projection. To sound the clarion call to Europe. Europe had better be preparing some plans right now. Otherwise, if they're caught on the back foot as well, all kinds of difficulty will start emerging.
But you think Europe can fight?
In terms of fighting America, they might fight in Greenland. They won't take it beyond Greenland. They won't take the fight to America. They won't attack or try to curtail any American military base or establishment in the European area. They won't try to call out America beyond a certain point in the United Nations. There'll be a phony war as much as anything else. There'll be all kinds of saber rattling, because sabers will have been drawn, but it won't come to, as it were, a full-scale world war. But it will come to a standoff of a militarized nature.
I'll be coming back to this issue towards the end. The possibilities around Greenland, but getting back to Trump and the Don Row, doctrine. Do you see this taking its course, especially given the pronouncement by Rubio yesterday, a kind of reassertion of the Monroe Doctrine, that we are in charge of the hemisphere, the Americas. This is our sphere. We don't want any interference, and we have the right to act as we wish. Can we expect? I know Philip will be talking about shortly, but do you expect that Colombia, Cuba in particular, are in the firing line right now? Mexico is.
Mexico not. Mexico's got too much density, too much by way of reserves, and also international support. Cuba certainly may be in a firing line, although not immediately. The Cubans also have preparations in depth of a militarized nature, and they've been expecting this day for quite some time. But certainly Latin America is under threat. Don't forget that the last time that militarily the Monroe Doctrine was enforced was the invasion of Grenada and the deposition of Morris Bishop, who was a legitimate leader, who was overthrown by force. The Americans established a country with hand-picked successors to Morris Bishop, and they pulled it off in Grenada. So they will be hoping that they can have the same happy, quote-unquote, result in Venezuela, which is a much larger country, of course. The problem is if they try to take on too many more countries, they don't have enough depth themselves to run all of these countries or to dictate and enforce what they want to dictate to all of these countries. Probably one or two in depth is about all they can manage at a time, famous last words. But not even the United States can run 3 or 4 countries at the same time. They don't have enough Spanish speakers to start with. Trump has been deporting those who can't speak Spanish. So again, there's biting off more than you can chew. You can call Maduro an illegitimate president. He runs a legitimate government. He ran a complex government. It was a proper government that could do things, even if a lot of what it did was to repress people. But this is a complex operation. You can't snap a finger and just take it over like that. Even just taking over the oil ministry is going to require a lot of skill, a lot of linguistic skill, and a very, very great deal of expertise in the oil industry. And I'm not even sure if the Americans have got that much depth and expertise in that particular industry, because their interests are already spread out so widely all around the world. So to concentrate all of that expertise into 1 or 2 locations is going to be a big ask even for the Americans.
I understand that. My last question to you for this time is, do you think there are politics of quid pro quo between the US on the one hand and Russia and China around Ukraine and Taiwan, respectively?
Basically, the Russians, when they marched into Ukraine, gave Trump the signal that he could do this kind of thing. So if you're going to point the finger of blame at anyone for starting it all, well, it can be at Putin. But even Putin didn't try to extract Zelensky. What Trump did in extracting the head of a sovereign state, kidnapping Maduro, that was new ground. The Chinese have had war plans for Taiwan for a long, long time now. I want to basically point out that the Taiwanese have had also for a very long time plans of resistance. Their army is mobilized. It's a highly technological army. The Chinese would pull it off, of course. They've got far more firepower, but their losses would be enormous if they tried a full-blown invasion of Taiwan. And they won't try an extraction of the Taiwanese president. They know that there's volatility in Taiwanese politics, with some of the leading candidates for the presidency favoring closer ties to China. They don't want to upset that apple cart. They would much rather the Taiwanese decided themselves to align themselves more closely with China. All the same, what Trump pulled off in Venezuela is making them, Russia and China, rethink what their options might be. So certainly in some foreign and defense ministries, plans would be being prepared right now for, could we do the same. Not should we do the same. That's a step too far right now. The plans are being made right now, I would say, could we do that? So that would be very, very much a paper that would be set on cabinet tables in a very, very short period of time.
Yeah, well, I asked the question also because of the frustration that most of us from the smaller nations of the world feel, sometimes nostalgic about the Cold War. At least given this kind of behavior by the US, one would have expected the Soviet Union and China to have reacted. We don't get the same kind of reaction from Russia and China in the face of this open piracy, international piracy on the part of the US. Why are China and Russia so quiet beyond the few noises in the Security Council?
You're not going to get more than a few noises, Sibo. Basically, everyone is hedging their bets right now. So if you're expecting a full-blown superpower confrontation, you're going to have major superpower differences. You're not going to get a confrontation. Everybody's got too many interests interlocked with one another. Everyone's got interests locked into the United States of America. There'll be all kinds of backroom traffic, of course, but you're not going to get any kind of major intervention from Russia or China. You're not going to get any kind of major militarized intervention. The Russians are surprisingly overstretched to a degree they did not expect in Ukraine. And the Chinese are basically hedging their bets not only with Taiwan, but with a resurgent and very vocal Japan. So they don't want to, as it were, overstep their resource base as well. In other words, every part of the world, superpower or not, is going through a period of instability and reassessment of what they could do if they had to. But each one would rather not have to go down the path of armed confrontation with anyone else.
There's a question there from Bettina Gappa. She says, I would like to ask the panel whether the Trump-Pro doctrine will survive Trump. Is DJT a maverick outlier, or is he crafting a Reagan-type legacy? Are these foreign policy impacts of MAGA here to stay? And Eleanor Sisulu, another question from her. Can they comment on Canada's position? Maybe quickly, Stephen, before I move to Philip, to deal with the same questions.
The Canadians are, of course, in a very difficult position since they have a long land border with the United States. What you've actually got in Canada is a very, very wise leadership at this moment in time, technologically accomplished, a central bank governor in 2 countries, someone who knows his way around the world, someone who's on first name terms with many of the world leaders. So the Canadians are playing it cautiously, but they're also playing it quite emphatically. They would object to what Trump is doing in Venezuela. They would object to what Trump would wish to do in other parts of the world. And certainly they object to the early Trump salvo saying that Canada should itself become part of the United States. Remember, the very first people that Trump offended in this offensive of his of taking over countries was Canada. Yes. So Canada's had some time to get its psychological act together to resist Trump. Now, of course, if it came to a military firefight, the Canadians are not anywhere near as strong as the Americans. But then the big question is, how strong are the Americans? How many fronts could they hold down at the same time? So I think the Canadians are thinking that they are relatively safe right now. They can play a game of stare out. And I think that Carney, the leader of America, who's very much got the right idea in terms of the psychological response that he and the Canadians can give to Trump at this moment in time.
Yes, or the other question, Trump-Pro, is this as long as Trump is there, or is something that we can expect to become a legacy, Reagan type?
The Monroe Doctrine is here to stay. It can be resurrected by Republican or Democrat alike. It's something nice to have to fall back on if they want to be belligerent and dominating their neighborhood. Not saying they always will. There's been a big gap since the last use of the Monroe Doctrine. But it survived all this time through Democrat and Republican governments because it's nice to have as a fallback if you want to use it. The Americans have never been isolationist. They've always been expansionist if they have to be. And this provides a nice, easy formulation for them to be expansive in their own backyard.
Thanks, Stephen. Now, Philip, karibu bwana. Really, the impact, first of all, if you can tell our viewers what really happened the night of the 3rd of January, and what has been the impact on Venezuela itself, the Caribbean in general, and what are the fears and anxieties around what is going on. Notice, for example, the silence in the Caribbean. There's been little or no statements at all from the Caribbean leaders. I haven't seen anything from CARICOM. Anyway, the floor is yours, Philippe.
Okay, thank you. Thank you also, Professor Chen, for setting the global stage. A couple things in response to your question, and even to the question about whether the Dunroe Doctrine will survive Trump, is that on the night of January 3rd, the reason it seemed like it was such a precision victory, almost an unopposed invasion or attack, the capture of the president and his wife, the execution of several Cuban medical personnel, and the destruction of Chavez's mausoleum or the memorial for him. That happened in less than an hour. Today, it was announced that the general responsible for counterintelligence has been arrested for espionage and for collaborating with the enemy. On that same day, there was a simultaneous attack against, an attempt against the government of Burkina Faso, of Captain Ibrahim Traore. So they looked like they were trying to take out what they considered to be troublemakers in West Africa, on the Sahel, as well as in Venezuela or in South America, because Trump immediately signaled that he was going after Preto in Colombia, Canel in Cuba, and anybody else who, Greenland, and there was somebody else that he called. Well, he had already bombed Nigeria, allegedly going after Muslims who had been oppressing Christians. Now, all of this, so when we look at the multipolar shift that BRICS represents to the unipolar dominance of the United States since the end of World War II. And remember, the end of World War II, we saw the independence of India and the defeat of the expulsion of the Japanese, the defeat of Chiang Kai-shek, and the emergence of the Chinese Communist Party as the ruling group in China. 1972, the Caribbean, which had only been independent some less than 10 years, less than a decade, formed something called CARICOM, the Caribbean Community, right here in Chaguaramas, where I'm speaking to you right now. And in forming CARICOM, they declared that the Caribbean would be considered a zone of peace, with the exception of Professor Chen mentioned Grenada, 1983, the overthrow of Maurice Bishop. Even then, the United States used the pretext of defending American medical students at St. George's University. CARICOM has not been silent. They are being silenced. The prime ministers of Antigua, Barbuda, and Dominica were threatened. In fact, their citizens were charged $15,000 for a visa until they agreed that they would accept, reluctantly with their arms in an arm bar, that they would accept deportees from the United States, deportees from anywhere. Let's just remember that many of the Venezuelans who voted for Trump in the United States were deported. Even American citizens were deported, not even to Venezuela. Over 300 of them were taken to concentration camp, prison in Honduras, in El Salvador. So the pretext of going after President Maduro and his wife, and by the way, the media is not showing the millions of people that have been on the streets open mic in front of Miraflores in support of President Maduro. Remember, so 1972 Zone of Peace, CARICOM. 1999, Hugo Chavez was elected president after having attempted a coup when Carlos Andres Perez was the president, and then being pardoned by Rafael Caldera. He faced the population and won a massive victory in Venezuela. 2002, there was an attempted coup d'etat in Venezuela by military in supported by the United States, and millions of people came down from the hills to support, and they had no choice but to release Chavez. I should point out that when they extracted Noriega on drug trafficking charges, even though he had been their foil and a CIA asset to them, they bombed the black communities of Panama. Similarly, when they attacked Venezuela the other night, they bombed Higuerote, a black community in Venezuela. And if you notice the complexion of the demonstrators who are supporting Maduro, they are brown, black people, poor people. And in my opinion, the mobilization of the masses of people in Venezuela, in Colombia, in Brazil, is the only recourse that these leaders will have. And I dare say the same will be true in Zimbabwe and in the rest of the Caribbean. Because if the governments will not educate and protect the people, then the people must develop the capacity to educate and protect, and if necessary, govern ourselves. And this is what we're facing right now in terms of this existential threat in the Caribbean. Coming back to the universality, we will also have to depend. They're not showing millions of people on the streets of Washington, D.C., not only opposed to the occupation, military occupation of the streets of D.C., but opposed to the illegal invasion and extraction of President Maduro. The onus is now going to be on. See, they didn't take him to Guantanamo, where they could have done extrajudicial killing or extreme rendition. They now have to face courts in New York. Not kangaroo courts, but courts who are going to say, what are the charges? Where is the evidence? Not like the 100 boats that they blew up or the 100 people who were killed, and they showed not one shred of evidence, not one witness saying that they were carrying narcotics. So the test is now going to be on the people. Will the people of the United States, the people of Europe, the people of Africa, the people of the Caribbean, of South America, of Asia, begin to recognize that even though BRICS represents one rational possibility in terms of multilateral, multipolar governance, there also is the possibility, as Professor Chen intimated, of a division of the world between those Russia's empire, America's empire, China's empire. And of course, they want to assign it's going to be a scramble once again for Africa. I think it is not a foregone conclusion. Much of what the outcome is will depend upon us.
Philip, just a follow-up question. What do you expect to happen in the coming weeks with respect to the Venezuelan situation? Certainly, as Stephen has indicated, the Americans may have bitten more they can chew on Venezuela itself. I mean, the inane claim by Trump that they are now in charge of Venezuela, it may be difficult to sustain that, given what we are hearing, namely that the government is still intact in Venezuela, that there's massive support from the population, and the curious contradiction in which Trump has virtually outlawed the Nobel Prize winner. So what do you think are the likely developments in Venezuela?
Very good question, and it's a very difficult question to answer. One thing is true is that Delcy Rodriguez is not in Russia. She did not run away. She has not given carte blanche to Trump, and she is standing with the leadership and the people of Venezuela to resist the continued violation of their sovereignty. They've declared that Maduro continues to be the president, that he was illegally abducted, and he needs to be returned. Now, that is true whether or not the responses of China and Russia are muted, notwithstanding their desire for the oil in Venezuela. I really think that it will depend, because Trump now has to come up with a pretext on how he's going to convict Maduro, and how does the conviction of Maduro translate into the control of Venezuela's oil by Trump and his cronies in the oil industry. How do they manage, without the cooperation of the Venezuelan people or the Venezuelan government, to expropriate, to denationalize not only the petroleum sector, but the rare earth minerals, the gold, the silver that they try to abscond with. It's not going to be an easy task. And that's why programs like this, which alert critical thinking on the part of the listeners, are critical in order to affect the outcome. Those people who simply throw up their hands and say, well, it's going to have to be decided by the big powers, Russia, China, the United States, I think are making a big mistake, and they're conceding too much ground. I think that what will happen, you mentioned a massive demonstration of the Afro-Latinos in Brazil, Venezuela, Colombia, that's coming up, I think you said on February 6th. There are several. That's why I wasn't familiar with that exact date, but there are several happening all the time, physical and virtual meetings that are informing and therefore empowering and activating people to to reject the narrative, the so-called Monroe Doctrine narrative. Remember, that was at the beginning. James Monroe was the 5th president of the United States, and that notion of defending the liberty of newly independent countries, or countries that were winning their independence. Remember, that was the time of Simon Bolivar. Look at the map of Venezuela. Where does it come from? It comes straight from Haiti. Haiti was the one leading and not only the anti-colonial struggle, but the anti-slavery struggle, the anti-racism struggle. And that struggle is continuing in Haiti as it is in Venezuela and the rest of the Caribbean.
So, in short, you think that Maduro will be back home soon?
I wouldn't venture to say that he will be back home soon, but I think that Maduro's fate will depend to a great extent on the agitation, the activism of the people of Latin America. Not only the support of the government. I mean, they could swoop in and take Delcy Rodriguez, whose father was murdered by the CIA as a revolutionary in Venezuela. But you know, they take one, and another one comes up. The issue is what will they use to try and suppress the people to impose a Marco Rubio dictatorship? And he's even trying to justify his position, this Monroe Doctrine position, on the basis of illegal narco trafficking or human trafficking. And yet no evidence has been presented. So as the trial in the United States, in New York, unfolds with Maduro and his wife, what's taking place on the ground in the Caribbean as we demonstrate, as we agitate, as we write and we hold programs like this, as what's taking place in Venezuela, in Colombia, in Ecuador, in Brazil, will, I think, affect the outcome. And I think Maduro, as important as he is secondary to what is done with the sovereignty of Venezuela. And I think that is determined more on the actions of the people of Venezuela than it is even on the government.
Yes, and therefore the question to all of you, which you deal with, Steve, when you come back, but the other panelists, including Philip, what is the future of the UN now, given this open breach, blatant breach of the international law? What can we expect of the UN and the Security Council, for that matter? So consider that later. Paul,
Thank you.
You are next.
Thank
Maybe you
you.
can begin with that broad question before you come to the impact on Africa. How will this affect the UN?
Asante sana.
Yeah. Okay.
Asante sana mwalimu. Ninafurahi kuwa. Look, I think the UN system, the UN international system has been under strain for some time now. One might say over the last decade or so, the United Nations system has become severely, severely strained, incapacitated, hollowed out. There have been withdrawals of some of the major assessed contributors. Yesterday, we saw a directive that is withdrawing the United States, for instance, from over 60 multilateral institutions. But again, this is not new. We've seen it over the years. And we have seen major founding members or original founding members, certainly what the UN looked like during the struggles for independence in different African countries, those members failing to stand up and to defend the United Nations. So the United Nations system is under a lot of strain. There's been a lot of retrenchment of critical officers and critical institutions like UNDP, UNESCO, the World Food Programme, the FAO, ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Organization. A lot of these institutions now lack funding. And so the services of the United Nations, the bulk of which are delivered to poor countries. I mean, African countries are the largest beneficiaries, for instance, of United Nations assistance. All the specialized UN agencies, much of their work is on the African continent. And we usually don't talk about this, but the African continent has the plurality of staff, volunteers, permanent workers, and so on, contract staff, consultants, in the entire UN system. The bulk of that comes from Africa, from Africans. So whenever we hear about UN staff being killed in conflict zones and UN staff being harassed and that kind of thing, we should remember that if we are to see the composition of those staff, a large number of those will be from Africa and from Caribbean countries. These are countries that invest very heavily in the United Nations, in positions and so on. We look at peacekeeping. The bulk of the world's deployed peacekeepers are African boots and African civilian peacekeepers. They're the ones in the firing line. They're the ones that are taking most of the casualties. Whenever UN staff are being harassed in these peace missions, these peace mission environments, the vast bulk of those will be African. So Africa has a strategic stake in the dismantling of the UN international system. Now, granted, when this system came into place, we all know that African countries were subjects. We were fighting for independence. And so African countries do have grievances in the international system, but took a pragmatic approach to say, much as their grievances and much as African countries were not there, with the exception of Ethiopia, Liberia, and apartheid South Africa, nevertheless, there was a pragmatic approach to say, let's try and propose measures that can improve the workings of the United Nations. So there's the Azulwini Consensus, there's the Sirte Declaration, and others. And it's the United Nations and international law that provide this protective umbrella for small states and for African countries and for the countries of the Caribbean as well. So African countries have this is a direct impact. The degradation of that system is very, very bad for African countries. And the lack of defense of these institutions. The fact that you have international judicial organizations that are under sanctions, that have been sanctioned, the International Criminal Court, these institutions, the Rome Statutes, which is actively been undermined. So it's very bad. It's very bad. It's very bad. It's very bad for Africa and for African countries. But let me also move to the other impacts of what we have seen these past few days, where it appears to be the case that the world is moving back to the 19th century Hobbesian experience, where it's really the law of the jungle as opposed to the rule of law. That has a direct impact on Africa in a number of ways. The first is these countries are unstable, and many of these countries also have divisions that can be exploited. One of the, it seems to me at least, when we look at Venezuela, clearly there were divisions in that country that were certainly exploited. This was not really a military operation in the strict sense of the term. This appears to have been more of an intelligence operation, where those that needed to be compromised were compromised, those that needed to be bought off were bought off. The speed at which it occurred doesn't really suggest, at least to me, military prowess or any of that. It seems to have been more of an intelligence operation. So African countries should be extremely worried because they too, many of them, face difficulties and divisions of this type that can easily be exploited, and where sections of a government or a regime can easily peel away from the top leadership. African countries also have a lot of experience in this regard. In fact, when we look at the demise of a number of African leaders that met their end in situations where there was an extraterritorial application of force, Patrice Lumumba, Joe Gabi in Harare, Samora Machel, very many others, right? So African countries are also coming from that collective memory and for that collective experience. And so to see a scenario where you're going back to that possibility is certainly very, very troubling. The other troubling thing for me is the whole idea. There's an argument that sovereignty is conditional. Is conditional on the dictates of those that wield overwhelming power. It's also very problematic. As we speak today, Somaliland has been recognized by Israel. In fact, the Israeli foreign minister is in Somaliland today, and Somalia has objected. The position of the African Union is well known. The position of the Global Pan-African Movement and other African intergovernmental and international institutions, the position on sovereignty, and sovereignty as defined by the OAU and the AU Charter is well known, but that is being openly challenged. And so when we talk about what is happening in the larger Western Hemisphere, elements of that are also very evident on the African continent. The battle of sovereignty. What does sovereignty mean? What is sovereignty going to look like in an international system where the United Nations is being relegated to irrelevance? So I think we're beginning to see that in the Horn of Africa, and the question is, how will African countries and the African Union respond? The other very alarming issue, and I think this is my second last point, is certainly the environment that African countries are now finding themselves in, where it's about transaction, it's about giving a pound of flesh to be able to survive another day or another month or another week or so. That's actually how somebody put it a few days ago. It sounds dramatic, but it's very real. What do you do to defend yourself? What do you do to protect yourself? What do you do if you have a partner that basically tells you, we have 5 billion or 10 billion for this number of things, but for you to access this is what you must give. Another question is, if you don't give that and you say, okay, we're not going to take the 10 billion, we're going to look elsewhere, will there be a consequence? So countries have to think very carefully now. What is interesting is, so Museveni has spoken out. Museveni has talked about, he said that Africa doesn't have a center of gravity. So if a country is manhandled, then it does not have recourse. There's no center of gravity that can rise to the defense of a country that is manhandled. And the African countries that have been manhandled, we've seen this since February, right? Without going into specificities. And his argument was that there's no center of gravity on the continent, and the issue of strategic security has not been addressed properly, and so on. But now the question is, what is to be done? What is to be done about that? There was there's been a lot of talk about, will African countries now seek closer defense cooperation and defense alliances, for instance, within BRICS? What I find very interesting is that the exercises that South Africa, China, Russia, and Iran are conducting under the BRICS system have not been cancelled. They start tomorrow. What are we to make of that? Are African countries going to move in that direction? To what extent has this stimulated fears among sitting governments and sitting presidents and so on, given the history that African countries have gone through? So I think I will close with 4 policy questions. The first is, what is the AU's role, the AU's political role? So the AU has released a statement, short statement, but now the question is, what comes after that? How do African countries interpret these events, and what do African countries do? There's the issue of critical minerals. Now, there's an environment now where countries can trade access to critical minerals in exchange for protection, in exchange for security and other things. So in a sense, the world order that is effectively covering itself up so now, how effective are the critical minerals? We talk about value addition. What kind of policy framework needs to be put in place to be able to ensure that those critical minerals are actually used for the benefit of the countries concerned? I think that's a major policy issue that African countries are going to have to think about, especially because critical minerals and access to natural resource endowments, this is part of the justification that we have seen with not just with Venezuela, but with other countries that have been mentioned for this type of treatment. What about the issue of solidarity? The issue of closer regional integration, regional engagement, the issue of the African Continental Free Trade Area. Because when we talk about coercion, the use of coercive methods to get countries to do what powerful countries want them to do. The military and intelligence instrument is not the only coercive. The economic coercion is almost always part of the picture. Certainly, Venezuela had lost about 75% of its oil revenues, and the country was really, really on its knees economically. That weakened its ability to resist or perhaps even to respond. So I think these are very, very serious questions. I think let me conclude with a question that was raised earlier, which is, to what extent was narcotics part of this equation? Well, I think we should look at what happened in November. The former president of Honduras, Juan Orlando Hernandez, was serving a 45-year jail sentence in the United States. He'd been convicted for both in and out of office for having been part of a system that smuggled 400 tons of cocaine into the United States. But he received a presidential pardon in November. So, if narcotics was the primary driver of this, then that development in November raises a lot of questions as to whether that was really the true intention of the operation that we saw in Venezuela. So I think I'll just stop there. But these are the issues I wanted to raise in terms of implications for African countries.
You've done well, Paul, in this regard. But only one question: you raised the AU position. I mean, it's been a lame statement by the AU, not understandably, and of course the role of Israel in vis-a-vis the AU and many of our African countries has to be noted, and the extent to which Israel has been a proxy for the US. The second point, of course, is that you spoke about the critical minerals issue. We have already a deal. You didn't want to mention countries, but the DRC and Rwanda, the summit which was held in the White House with the leaders sitting next to Trump. And clearly, while there is an expression of the re-expression of the and the reassertion of the Monroe Doctrine, with the emphasis on the hemisphere, that this hemisphere, the Americas, is ours, it has not precluded interference on the African continent. And given the current scramble for Africa, especially with regard to critical minerals, don't we expect more problems ahead? Not only in the Great Lakes area, but even South Africa, given the verbal attacks against South Africa by Trump and his administration. And thirdly, given the pointed objectives of the US to counter China in Africa, what might be the possible scenarios, briefly, as we go forward, in the case where this scramble for Africa, this conflict over Africa, might play out?
Well, thank you for those questions, Prof. I'm certainly we have to worry. The continent is I think finds itself in a very precarious position, because whenever there is a scramble, quote unquote, for Africa, the consequences are never pleasant. And if the scrambles that we saw during the Cold War are anything to go by, then destabilization of the continent will increase. There's no doubt about that. So I think this would be my first comment. Certainly, the African region is not, just because it's not in the Western Hemisphere does not mean that it's not going to be affected. African countries also have built strong ties with CARICOM, have built strong ties with the CARICOM countries. South Africa, for instance, had a very very good working relationship with Venezuela. The role of Cuba on the African continent is well known. African solidarity with Cuba is very well known. And there has been a lot of movements of solidarity back and forth between Africa, for instance, and Brazil and many African countries. So it's not, so African countries will be certainly directly affected by what is happening. South Africa is an interesting one, because much as the tension between the two countries, between South Africa and the United States over a number of issues, but if we look at just one of those issues, which is the allegation that there is a genocide against Afrikaners in the country, that may be dismissed as disinformation or innuendo, but it is a policy objective, and it has set policy machinery moving in terms of immigration, in terms of the fast tracking of those that can claim that persecution to migrate into the United States. So it is now a policy objective, and some South Africans are arguing that in itself is destabilizing the country, in the sense that it actually undermines the post-apartheid consensus. So I'm using that example to just highlight that.
Paul, another example. Example. On Christmas Day, the U.S. was involved in military action in Nigeria.
I forgot to mention that. Yes. So we have we have Somaliland, we have Somalia, we have Nigeria, the strike in Nigeria, and if the Nigerian reporting is anything to go by, those strikes those strikes shocked Nigerians as much as they shocked Nigeria's neighbors. So yes, there's a direct impact on African countries, and I think a lot of questions are going to be asked about how strong the African Union is to mount an effective response, what African countries need to be able to do, the critical minerals piece of it. Yes, the discussion on value addition, as I had mentioned, is a very legitimate one. But another question is, how does one get to that, to adding that value? How much incentive is there when critical minerals are generally seen as part of the largesse, that can be doled out? If with that aspect in mind, African countries are simply just going to be vulnerable to more destabilization. So this is how I look at it, and certainly
it's very useful, Paul. Very useful indeed.
Certainly developing story, but certainly very worrying. And allow me.
Yeah, I'll be asking you to come later on in summarizing your presentation. Yeah. But let me turn to Tafazwa, who has been waiting very patiently. Tafazwa, you wanted to begin with what you wanted to say first and foremost. Please go ahead.
Well, I'll just say that as Prof. Mandaza indicated earlier on, I'm an early academic, currently doing a postdoc, having finished my PhD. But my views on this question are not really influenced by being an academic, but are influenced by years of being a socialist activist who believes in the power of the working class. And I believe that what has happened in Venezuela offers lessons to the working class as the power lies in the working class. Firstly, I would say that what happened in Venezuela is a new phase of open imperialist aggression. Trump has shown that his regime is tearing apart the pretense of international law and the so-called rules-based international order. We're talking about the UN. He has shown that he doesn't have respect for them, and he's launching military threats and trade wars to secure control over global resources and markets. So the lesson to African countries, African working class, is that they need to come together to rebuild their movements in order to defend themselves. For me as a socialist, I know this question at this point would be controversial, because looking at what has happened in Venezuela, the lesson for the working class is that they should not support the authoritarian nationalism and should also not have illusions in imperialism. I do not give political support to Nicolas Maduro or the bureaucratic, authoritarian, anti-working class capitalist national regime that he was presenting. Over the years, Maduro and his ruling elite have presided over economic collapse, hyperinflation, chronic condition shortages, rampant corruption, and systematic repression of worker struggles and popular dissent. So what do we see? What was happening in Venezuela? Democratic control from below had been eroded. So the lesson that for the working class is to take the control of the democratic control from below. And also, I want to compare the Venezuelan situation with the Zimbabwean, the similarities that imperialists, the interests of the imperialists, and also to say that regime change is not the liberation. What happened in Zimbabwe in 2017, we saw the removal of Mugabe through a military coup, and it was accompanied by widespread popular celebration. Not that the masses were supporting the coup leaders, but it's because the masses were exhausted by decades of economic collapse, corruption, repression, and authoritarian rule. So the coup did not present the victory for the working class. And why is that? It's because the regime, the opposition at that time, the MDC, also entered into an alliance with the military to remove Mugabe, and did not empower the masses on the ground to take control. Otherwise, the masses could have taken control and to take power from the ZANU-PF regime. So the lesson to the Venezuelans and also other Africans is that it should not be hijacked by the imperialist forces, as it is happening right now. That Trump is already appearing like a peacemaker in Venezuela, but the workers should pursue their own interests. Both Zimbabwe and Venezuela, they implemented radical nationalist measures. Zimbabwe, the land reform, and then Venezuela, the oil nationalization. And because of that, they became targets of the imperialists. Sanctions were imposed on the countries. On Zimbabwe, sanctions were imposed, and they were said that they were targeted sanctions, but they were sanctions that affected the working class. As I've said, that there were rampant shortages that resulted in the working class celebrating the removal of Mugabe. And there was also channeling of resources to the NGOs, trade unions, and organizations for regime change agenda, and not empowering the working class. So the aim of the masses should not be manipulated. Yes, there is need to defend Venezuela against the sovereignty of the country, against the imperialist forces. But there is also need now for the working class to now seize the opportunity of what has happened. Already we are seeing the other faction of Maduro, the Vice President Delcy, already sending signals of a willingness to cooperate with the U.S. imperialism. Already Trump announced the new arrangement of 50 barrels of Venezuelan oil placed under U.S. control. The same thing that happened in Zimbabwe, the British imperialists struck a deal with the ZANU-PF faction that was led by Mnangagwa and Chiwenga, sidelining the Western-backed MDC, the way Morgan Tsvangirai, the way the opposition leader is just been sidelined by Trump. So given that, coming from a socialist background, I say that it's only the empowering the working class that can liberate the masses of Venezuela. The way the Bolivarian revolution, when they defeated the imperialist backed coup, and the lessons for Zimbabwe and other African countries, and especially for my country, Zimbabwe, is to take advantage of what is happening in Venezuela. Yesterday, I attended a meeting that was hosted online in South Africa, attended by about 170 people. And in that meeting, it was highlighted that the 6th of February has been set aside as a day of global protest, like what we were doing last year, the protest against the genocide in Israel. So for Zimbabwe, for South Africa, is to take advantage of that day, protesting against the imperialist forces, but also saying no to capitalist policies that are being held in their country. Here in Zimbabwe, saying no to the 2030 agenda, saying no to the neoliberal austerity measures that has seen the suffering of people, the deindustrialization, the retrenchment that is taking place. The same process in South Africa, saying no to imperialism, but also saying no to deindustrialization, and also saying no to the constant threats that Trump is continues threatening South Africa. So those are the lessons that we should learn, and also the need to take of the ordinary people to claim the resources, because the imperialists are after the resources of Africa, of Latin America, and so forth. So these resources are being taken, but yet the masses in these countries are suffering. So this protest in support of Venezuela against the imperialists will also be demanding to take control of their resources in all these countries. So this is what I mean. I have to start saying the lessons for the working class.
Thanks, Tafazwa. It's a very important dimension that you took. But you know, the problems that we're facing in our respective countries with respect to organization of the working class, as you have said. We mentioned Zimbabwe and South Africa in this regard. We have seen the SCTU in tatters. We have seen the COSATU in tatters. It is a reflection of the dominance, not only of the petty bourgeoisie, but also of the comprador class that now run our countries. And the linkage between the comprador class and the imperialists that we talk about. But more important for our discussion here, and as Jeff Sachs said in the Security Council the other day, is this is not about Maduro. This is really about the flagrant violation of international law international rule of law, and the blatant disregard for sovereignty, the abduction of a head of state and his wife. This is what we're talking about. And the 6th of February protest in liaison with other international organizations is really primarily against the US invasion of Venezuela. On that note, I want to now move by beginning with yourself, Tafazwa. What action should we take beyond just words, in particular with regard to what Paul has really outlined in detail, the erosion of the UN system, the UN Charter in particular, as demonstrated last week? How shall we restore the centrality of the UN as the citadel, the foundation of world peace? What is your view, Tafazwa? That's your last word.
Well, as I've said, that I'm coming from a socialist background that believes in the working people's power. The UN power can only also be restored by the working class. You say that the organ, I mean, you highlighted the ZCT, UCOSAT, and so forth, that they've been weakened. But I say that there is need to take advantage of what has happened and to show the working class that right now you cannot have the illusions in the UN to liberate us. But we can only, it is through our work, our power to rebuild the UN. So it's taking advantage of that. We have protested at the United States Embassy in Harare, saying no to what has happened in Venezuela, but also adding these things to say we now want power to be restored to the United Nations. We want the AU to have voice to protect us. Without doing that, yes, the leaders can do that. But as I've highlighted that Chavez in 2002 was saved by the power of the masses. So it's only by rebuilding the masses that we'll be able to save these institutions for them to survive and to have meaningful interventions for our countries against the imperialist interventions, the aggression of the imperialists.
Thanks, Tafazwa. Also, thank you for coming on the platform belatedly. It was you responded almost promptly to a late invitation. Thank you very much. We'll be we'll keep in touch. Yes, thank you. Paul, Karibu, your last word.
Asante. My last word is is the importance of revisiting, re-energizing, and boosting solidarity at all levels, people to people, academic research, policy making, parliaments, between Africa and the CARICOM countries and Latin America. I think this had always been there. It had always been there. It was there during the anti-colonial struggles. The anti-colonial struggles saw, freedom fighters on both ends, participating in one another's struggles. The role of Cuba is very well known. And it's very, very important. It's very important that solidarity is realized again and translated into active, practical programs that the two sides, the peoples of the two sides can push forward with. And this is going to be something that will have to be done not outside government. It has got to be a people-to-people process, and people-to-people processes have succeeded in bringing about strategic change in a number of areas. We saw the strength of the anti-apartheid movement, even the African anti-colonial movement. A lot of that was people-to-people based, and also the struggles that we have seen in Haiti and other parts of the Caribbean have really been people-to-people led. And I think this is a time when civil society on both sides have got to wake up and really take the torch.
Thanks, Paul, and thanks again for taking the courage to join us and for your very, very inspiring analysis of the UN. I think it really helped us in the discussion. Thanks, Paul. Asante sana.
Asante.
Taonana.
Aye.
Baadaye. Okay.
Ah, yeah. Asante, Prof.
Philip, karibu. I saw you shaking your
Asante.
head when Tafaz was making a comment about Maduro. You may start there before you give us the last
Yes,
word.
thank you. Thank you. First of all, I want to say thank you for organizing this forum. Thank you to all of the participants. And my sister, I wanted to say you have to be careful. The point that the brother Paul made about the role of Israel in Somaliland extends to the AU, and the fact that the AU admitted Israel as an observer at the same meeting that they denied Haiti the same kind of status. So the pervasive influence of Israel is not just in espionage and in warfare and blowing people up when they're talking on the phone, but it extends also to propaganda. And the question is, to what extent are we buying the propaganda that Maduro is a dictator, when you're seeing the huge demonstrations in the streets coming out to support him, when you're seeing the same policies that Brother Paul talked about in terms of, and you referred to yourself as far as how do you enact policies to protect your resources so that they work, your critical resources so that they work on behalf of the people. It's because Chavez and then Maduro continue to use the resources of Venezuela to benefit and raise people out of poverty that they are now being sanctioned. At first, the pretext was drugs, anti-drugs. Then we're going to create this blockade. And now he's saying this is our oil and our land. I have to correct something. The propaganda was that Delcy Rodriguez went to Russia. That is a lie. Delcy Rodriguez working with the Venezuelan government. Now, whether they're going to try to extract her, they'll have to extract Deodado Cabello, they'll have to extract every member of the cabinet because they have already identified where the treachery was. But the people of Venezuela are saying that they support the reforms and they support their government. So if Zimbabwe, if Namibia, if Burkina Faso, if Nigeria has the audacity to decide to control its resources to benefit the quality of life of their people, no government can do it without the support of the people. And to the extent that we are using fora such as this, of course they're monitoring it and they'll try to disrupt and distort what we said. But to the extent that we can reach our people with truth which knows no fear, they will shiver. Because the fact is that once the people are in control, I don't care how long they try to occupy Venezuela, they cannot win. And that's what Cuba has shown. It was on the battlefield of Huito Canavale, right, in Angola, that they defeated the apartheid forces supported by Israel and the United States. At Harvard University, you mentioned Brother Stefan Chen, they are now trying to emasculate these universities. Harvard has been in the forefront of the resistance to this emasculation, and yet at the very helm of Harvard is someone who I would say cannot distinguish the difference between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. So the struggle, but Harvard alumni such as myself are working with our colleagues in order to make sure that at that level of struggle, the intellectual, the academic, it reaches and it has to get out of the ivory tower to the masses, those same working classes that my sister's talking about, in order to shatter the lies and the propaganda that are trying to present an image that we are already defeated. My final point is, Brother Ibo, that the United Nations has betrayed us more than it has served us. I'm not saying it hasn't done good work. I'm not saying that there are not great people inside the United Nations. Some of them are my closest people. However, I think the time has now come, even beyond BRICS, because BRICS has Russia, China, and the others, for us to rebuild a grassroots, which is what I think we're doing at the Global Pan-African Movement, a grassroots Pan-African movement that empowers the people across borders and that builds coalitions with other grassroots organizations working on behalf of working class, workers, cognitariat, peasants, whatever you want to call it, unemployed people, in order to build people's power and popular governance. Thank you for having me on the program.
Asante, Filipe. Asante sana. Thank you very much indeed. Stephen Chan, your last words, sir.
Well, again, a word of thanks to you.
For this occasion only. For this occasion, I mean.
To all my good colleagues. I really enjoyed everything that people have had to say. So thank you very, very much. Working in the framework of what there is right now, rather than what I would like to see, the reform of the United Nations, and I've spoken much about this in Turkey, of all places, depends upon the reform of the Security Council. That's what has got to be affected in terms of any democratization drive in the United Nations. Without that, reform of the United Nations is completely futile at this moment in time. I would like to also offer some support in terms of building some backbone in the West to resist the policies of Donald Trump. That means putting some backbone into my own Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, who seems to be setting a masterclass in dithering right now and not being decisive and not being standing up for principle. But also I would like to offer support to those who are rising up in the United States itself as figures of opposition to Donald Trump. People like Zoran Mandani, the new mayor of New York, people like Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, building coalitions to stand against Trump, both in America and also in other countries that purport to have liberal values. Those, I think, are things that an academic can and should be able to do. And offering support, of course, to my brothers and sisters, despite the fault of their presidents in places like Harvard and Colombia, and all the other universities who have to be in the leadership of taking a stand against people like Trump. So for me, offering specific forms of solidarity, targeting very, very particular forms of reform in the United Nations, those are things that I'll be devoting both my work and my writing to in the future. But in the meantime, let me reiterate, thank you. Thank you once again to all of my colleagues on this wonderful program. You've all been fantastic. I've enjoyed every word, every sentence that people have had to say. So thank you and good night.
Thanks, Stephen. Thanks very much. Thank you all.
Prof. Mandaza, can I just come with my last word on rethinking about the United Nations, AU, EU, NATO, all these organizations, SADC, when you look at them, they don't protect the working class. So for me, I think it's time the working class of the world, we build the international solidarity, now have to think of their own organizations that protects them. That's the lesson that we have to learn from the recent incident of Venezuela. Last year, we witnessed the genocide in Palestine. It was brought to the international court, but nothing happened. The genocide continued. But what happened was what put pressure were the demonstrations that were happening on the streets. So that's what the working class of the world now have to build, the international solidarity to defend themselves. Thank you.
Yeah, in collaboration with other forces, other popular forces, including enlightened middle classes. Very important. So, yeah, on that note,
yes.
we have the Global Pan-African Movement also, I think Philip forgot to mention, that we issued a statement on the Venezuela issue. And I want to say that to thank Philip, who helped draft that statement for us. Asante, thank you. Again, thank you all. And those who have joined us, this will be on YouTube. And most, as a practice here, most people follow this on YouTube and keep in touch with our website. Please support this program by liking this video and subscribing to our channel. Thank you and goodbye.
komi moto ona bango. Ona bango.